Good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock, so the inquiry is resumed. Mr. Taylor, you ready to continue?
Yes, sir, I am. Thank you. Mr. Brass, I wanted to move on, please, to look at some points about the way in which, or the data from the allocation model. Mr. Ciro's proof, please, page 34, and I wanted to take you to his 6.3.3.
Certainly, just one moment. So 34.
Page 34, paragraph 6.3.3. So based on the output of your passenger allocation model, he identifies that the data on where passengers would travel to if Bristol Airport didn't expand assumes 62% of the additional 2 million passengers would travel to other airports. That's, I think, around about 1.24 million passengers. And the remaining 38% would not fly. That's the 760,000.
Yes.
So the 38%, the 760,000 people who would not fly, means that proportion of the demand that would be met if permission is granted is in effect induced demand. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And if we just think about the implications of that, Mr. Ciro, page 35 at the bottom, 6.3.6, looked at this, and he identified that of the 760,000 that do not fly, 14.6% are foreign passengers, and so you get down to 649,040 passengers are domestic passengers who don't fly. Those people, if they don't fly, will spend their money locally to the UK economy instead of abroad. Yeah.
The domestic passengers.
Yeah. No, because these are people who don't fly if permission. Permission is refused.
And you're talking about the proportion of people who don't fly.
Yeah.
Who are located domestically. Yes.
Sorry,
is that right?
I couldn't hear that last answer. Can you just say it again?
Sorry, I was trying to clarify the question. I just wanted to check. You were saying the domestic proportion of the 760,000-ish would spend their money locally.
Yes.
Is that what you were saying?
Yes, the 649,000 would spend in the UK economy instead. Yes?
Potentially. We don't know for sure.
Right. Okay. And that spend is not, there's no allowance for that in your impact assessment, is there?
No. We view it in a slightly different way, ultimately. I think it's fair to say. We say that those who do not fly, it is not safe to assume that though the economic activity that spend would have replaced, let me start again. The spend they would have made it's not safe to simply assume that it will be spent locally, as Mr. Serra implies, for a number of reasons. One, we have no idea whether they'll spend it locally or not. If they don't fly outbound from the UK, then for instance, if they're going on holiday, it's quite certainly possible they will just simply go somewhere else in the UK. They may spend it on import. They may spend it on. They may not spend it at all. They may simply save it. We don't know any of these things, and we also don't know ultimately that there will be economic activity there for them to spend it on. As we've already said, there's considerable amount of population growth expected over the period to 2030, and that those people will need jobs and will need investment. We have no guarantee that any of that investment will happen. Our view is therefore that in terms of private sector investment, we should be treating factory displacement extremely cautiously, and that by simply assuming 100% displacement, you are simply assuming away the benefits of investment.
But equally, to make no allowance at all means that your assessment can't be described as robust, Mr. Brass, because you're not allowing for any of the spend from that 649,000 people in your impact assessment.
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I think we are talking in terms of sort of the future jobs to be created. We are talking about very, very large numbers here, of which the airport's numbers are very, very small part of that. So I think our safest assumption, alongside the other things, is that no, there isn't factor displacement, or we should not be taking it into account if we are considering a private sector investment.
Okay, I've put my point. Let's move then away from displacement and on to discuss outbound tourism. Now, you, as I understand it in your assessment, include economic benefits from inbound tourism, but you don't make any inclusion in your process for loss to any of the three geographical catchments you look at from outbound tourism. That's right, isn't it?
That is correct.
Yeah. Now, outbound tourism has an economic impact. Money spent abroad is not spent here. That's right, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
It's material when looking at the economic impact of the proposed development to have regard to the level of outbound tourism spend abroad, isn't it?
It is important to consider it, certainly, and I think this is where we need to be careful, because there is a fundamental difference between inbound tourism and outbound tourism here. Inbound tourism, which I believe we've all agreed on at the end of the day, injects spend into the economy. There is no offsetting effects around it. For outbound tourism, the same isn't true. Yes, we can do a sum, just as Mr. Serro and Dr. Chapman have done, as to what outbound spend might be. We can do that, that's fine. However, we cannot sensibly make estimates of some of the offsetting effects that we've talked about at some length. And you cannot know also the benefits from outbound tourism. We cannot know how important outbound tourism is in attracting people to live and work around Bristol Airport, for instance. We don't know what that GDP contribution is. It is potentially quite high, but I don't have the evidence. I can't make an estimate of that. But across the piece, across all those things, our view and our judgment is that outbound tourism is not a material factor, because you have to look at both sides of the equation in relation to outbound tourism. You can't simply look at one. And again, I would come back to the DfT position, which I think we've been through before, that ultimately the DfT's judgment, based on the evidence they have, is that there is no material effect from outbound tourism.
Now, you're not suggesting, are you, that having regard to the you're not suggesting that the amount of spend associated with outbound tourism outside of the UK is irrelevant for a decision maker on this appeal, are you?
I'm not saying it is irrelevant.
Right.
I'm saying that you don't. Hang on. I'm saying that you don't know what the true effect is, and we all have to make a judgment. Mr. Serro has made a judgment, and his judgment is his judgment. That is entirely his prerogative. We have made a judgment, and we do not believe it is a material consideration because of the reasons I've just said.
Right.
If you cannot know both sides of it, we need to treat it qualitatively, and do as we have done. And again, I mean, I point back to that. This has never been considered as a material consideration, as far as I'm aware, in any planning application, for the very reasons I've just talked about.
Okay. So, just so we've got noted the point, you've made no attempt whatsoever to quantify the amount of spend by tourists outside of the catchment areas as a result of outbound tourism. That's right, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
Right. So to summarise, it's relevant, it's material, and it's not something which you've attempted to assess.
That's
where we've
no.
got, that's where we've got to, isn't it?
Sorry.
That's where we've got to. It's relevant, it's material, and it's not something that you've attempted to assess. That's where we've got to.
I would agree. I would agree with one of those. I would agree with it's relevant. I wouldn't agree that it's material, and I wouldn't agree that we haven't assessed it. We haven't quantitatively assessed it. We have assessed it in qualitative terms.
Right. Okay, that'll do me nicely. Thank you. Right, now in terms of a qualitative assessment, the social value of flying, if the expansion scheme for Bristol Airport's refused, we know on the basis of your allocation model, 1.2 million people still fly.
Yes.
So the refusal of permission doesn't affect the social value of flying to them. They still get on their business trip, they still get on their holiday.
I think it'd be helpful if you could define social value a little bit more closely.
Okay.
But
well, the way my learned friend put it to Mr. Ciro was that they the people who fly see value in the flight, see value in the holiday.
Yes.
On that basis, those 1.2 million people are unaffected in that sense because they still fly. Yeah?
They still, yes, they still fly. I agree with that, yes.
Yeah. That leaves us with the 760,000
Yes.
who would have flown but do not fly on the basis of your allocation model, the induced demand.
Yes.
Now, they simply choose not to fly. They spend their money on some other activity or holiday, don't they?
We've just discussed that, Mr. Taylor. We don't know the answer to that question.
Those that choose to holiday in the UK and have a staycation, that is a value to them. They get benefit from that, and they make that choice.
Yes.
All right, thank you. You're not suggesting, are you, that those who choose to have a staycation get something which is of less value than a holiday abroad?
No, I'm not suggesting that per se. I mean, I think there's a point around the quality of life and learning experience around overseas travel, which may be different, but I don't have evidence on that.
Okay. Now, it's right, isn't it, that Mr. Ciro recognised that there are uncertainties in assessing a quantitative level of economic disbenefit of outbound tourism in his evidence. Acknowledge that.
Sorry,
Mr.
acknowledge what, sorry?
Uncertainty in the assessment in quantitative terms, yeah. But he nevertheless got to a figure of £123 million.
He did, yes.
I don't understand you to dispute the process that and the methodology that he applied to get to that 123 million figure. That's right, isn't it?
As I previously stated in my rebuttal proof, I haven't looked at it in detail. It's not a calculation that ultimately I consider it to be relevant.
Right. Okay. He also recognised at page 52 of his brief, 837, that his estimates didn't include the welfare impacts of travelling abroad on holidays.
Yes, I believe that's correct, yes.
Yeah, okay. And clearly, it's relevant, isn't it, to have regard to both his appraisal of the negative impact of 123 million and indeed to not leave out of account the relative impact in the do nothing and do something in welfare terms. Is that right?
Sorry. I'm sorry, I may be able to short circuit this. Are we walking towards the point about Mr. Ciro's made about including outbound tourism expenditure in the socio-economic cost-benefit analysis?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think as Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman very rightly pointed out in their evidences in chief, anything, the welfare effect would need to be compared to the next best alternative. That would not obviously be their total amount. So no, it would not be correct. We don't know what the next best alternative is. So no, you cannot include it within the socio-economic cost-benefit analysis on Mr. Ciro and Dr. Chapman's own words.
Yeah, you have to look at it in qualitative terms, as we've just discussed.
Well, in my view, in terms of how to look at outbound tourism, to the extent that it is relevant, given the DFT's position, you do need to look at it in qualitative terms. Yes.
Okay. Thank you. All right, let's move on from that issue, and I just want to ask you some questions about the more local labour market context, if I may. Mr. Ciro's proof, page 43, please. His paragraph 7.2.2.
So just one moment, let me just get the right page. 7.2. Yes.
Now, here he refers to the direct jobs being provided by expansion as being likely to be low value and low skill posts, generally at high risk of being automated. He refers to the airport as a large employer in North Somerset, and that the expansion, if it does require additional employment in 2030, will reduce the labour supply pool for other firms in the area. Given that the area's unemployment rate is already below the national average, this may particularly impact local SMEs struggling to find employees. And he contrasts that position in the next paragraph with the economic policies aiming to improve the skill set of resident population. Do you accept that there is potential for a tightening of the local labour market if planning permission for expansion of Bristol Airport was granted?
I think, again, I think I've come back to the point we're going to have significant population growth moving forward, which means that there will be a significant number of people looking for work in the future. I think it is difficult to judge and know exactly what the future labour market will look like.
Okay. He also refers on this page to the Junction 21 enterprise area and explains that it currently accommodates 2,000 jobs with the aim of reaching a total of 9,000 to 10,000 jobs and 6,000 new homes by 2030.
Yeah.
In that context, the additional jobs associated with that you've identified with the expansion of Bristol Airport is a drop in the ocean compared to the importance of the Junction 21 enterprise area, isn't it?
Well, I don't know that we can actually tell from the data we've got. I've no idea, because I mean, we don't know whether there's gross or net jobs. We don't know anything about the jobs at all. We don't know where they're located. We don't know exactly who's going to be creating, because this is an enterprise area. Ultimately, we have to get somebody to invest and actually bring those jobs to North Somerset. Again, I'd point out that the North Somerset Council seems to be quite keen on using the Bristol Airport as a tool to try and secure some of those jobs. So some of the jobs that we're talking about are actually probably some of the jobs that we're talking about in relation to Bristol Airport as well. So I simply actually can't answer that question. I'm not entirely sure why it is relevant in a way, because we are comparing one thing with another.
Well, I can help with that, Mr. Brass. You see, do you remember right at the beginning of the cross-examination, I asked you some questions about weight, about the weight we give to benefits. And you would accept, wouldn't you, that a development that's going to deliver an additional 7 to 8,000 jobs in the period between now and 2030 is of much more significance in terms of provision of jobs than a development which is going to deliver in the region of 350, 400 jobs. The two are it's a different order, isn't it?
I would agree that on the ball face of it, yes, that is the case. They are of a different order of magnitude. But I'm not quite sure why the comparison is valid. And as I've just said, we don't know enough about the basis for the calculation of those jobs. You're also talking purely, I think, from memory, about the direct impact of the airport. You're not talking about the other elements as well, which will increase the size of those job numbers.
And we can bear that sort of point in mind when we're thinking about the weight that we give to the benefit of job creation associated with the expansion of Bristol Airport, can't we? That in relative terms,
are we saying
is small compared to, say, the enterprise area?
Well, if we take for a moment that the jobs are being examined on the same basis, which we don't know, there's nothing in Mr. Sirrow's project to tell us one way or the other on what basis those jobs have been calculated and what we're actually covering. If one thing is bigger than the other, yes, you might give more weight to the one thing that's bigger, but I'm not sure we're making an either-or choice here.
Right, okay. We're just looking at context, you see. Now, I want to move on to considering the regeneration of the pockets of deprivation. Now, as I understand it, we have a draft planning obligation. I don't know whether you're familiar with what is being proposed in terms of the Skills and Employments Plan. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with it in broad terms, yes.
Right, okay.
I'm not really involved in the negotiations around it, but I know what's in it broadly, yes.
I'm going to put some broad questions, so that should be okay. But if I put a question and you don't know the answer or anything, then I'm sure you'll say.
Fine.
Now, the Skills and Employment Plan in the draft that I've got is in Part 4 of Schedule 4, and it requires the submission of a Skills and Employment Plan within 6 months of the commencement of development. And that plan has to include, this is the phraseology, measures which aim to deliver employment opportunities at the airport for residents of the settlements in the vicinity of the airport, including South Bristol and Weston-super-Mare, and shall include, and then there's a list of 4 measures. So the first is a construction phase local labour agreement and action plan, which consists of a local labour agreement and action plan bound by the principles of the Construction Training Industry Board, and that's to relate to the construction phase of the development. The second element is an Achieve programme, it's called. This is to deliver employment and skills interventions at a programme of activities with education providers relating to the operational phase, and that includes a financial contribution of up to £300,000 to commission a specialist employment support provider to deliver a suite of employment and skills interventions to support residents to access end-use / operational phase jobs. The third element is an operational phase education programme, which requires engagement with the education sector from primary level through to university to develop opportunities for young people and adults to access employment at the airport. And the last element is a monitoring programme which sets out agreed key performance indicators against which the implementation of the plan will be monitored. Now, I was wondering if you can explain, please, what is envisaged by the suite of employment and skills interventions, what specifically that includes.
That is not an area I can comment on. I've not been involved in the negotiations around that.
All right. Fine. As we saw, that plan aims to deliver employment opportunities for residents in the settlements in the vicinity of the airport. Do you know which settlements those are?
My understanding is you're looking at places in Weston-super-Mare and within South Bristol, but I do not have the detail on that.
Right, okay. Thank you. Now, what isn't referred to in that part, or indeed anywhere in the planning obligation, are the transport links to be provided for those living in Weston-super-Mare, South Bristol, who don't have their own access to a car. Now, you, in your evidence in chief, said, well, there are already people from South Bristol and Weston who work at the airport.
Yes.
Are those people in lower paid or higher paid jobs?
I wouldn't have the data to be able to tell you that.
Right. So if those were higher paid people who could afford to buy a car, the fact that they work at the airport doesn't suggest that the lower paid would find the airport accessible, if that were the case? That would be right?
Well, I'm not sure that's something I could actually comment on. I just don't have the data to be able to answer the question.
In terms of public transport access from Weston and South Bristol,
Yeah.
For people finishing shifts at the early hours of the morning, what 24-hour public transport access is there from Weston and back to Weston and South Bristol? Do you know?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what the 24-hour position is now.
All right. That's fine. Well, we've seen the sort of generality of the skills and employment plan. Now, perhaps you could help me with this. How many jobs, if planning permission is granted for the airport to expand, how many jobs will be filled by residents of South Bristol or Weston-super-Mare?
I don't know. I don't believe targets have been set or anything of that nature. I simply can't answer that question.
Okay. What's the GVA impact on South Bristol of granting planning permission for the expansion of Bristol Airport compared to refusing?
We haven't got that level of granularity. I couldn't tell you the answer.
Okay. If I ask the same question about Weston-super-Mare, do I get the same answer?
You would get the same answer because our modelling works at North Somerset level and at a City of Bristol, well, no, actually West of England level.
Okay, so you adduce no evidence which demonstrates any quantitative economic benefit to South Bristol or Weston-super-Mare if planning permission for expansion of Bristol Airport is granted. That's right, isn't it?
That's correct. I'm not sure that we can sensibly estimate that.
Okay. So the follow-on question from that is that there is no evidence that any particular degree of economic benefit would be delivered in South Bristol or Weston-super-Mare if planning permission for the expansion of Bristol Airport was granted.
No, we have not presented evidence on that, but given the patterns of employment at the presently, we would think it reasonable to assume that GVA and indeed employment benefits would flow to those areas, particularly given the attempts by the airport through the skills and employment plan to secure benefits for those areas.
Well, a moment ago I asked you about what that actually entailed in terms of specific measures, and you didn't know, so we can look at your answer there in that context. Now, last aspects relate to the costs and benefit analysis. I want to ask you, please, to confirm that in terms of the costs, the air quality impacts and noise impacts have not been monetised in your economic impact assessment, and that's right, isn't it?
That is correct.
And there are methods for monetising those impacts that are known and well used, aren't there?
There are methods set out in WebTag. For instance, they are used and well known. However, the guidance in terms of WebTag as that is the one that's been mentioned by Mr. Ciro, is that we only would consider those effects where it is where they are expected to be significant. I would also point out again, of course, this is not a web tag assessment, and that noise and air quality is being assessed via a separate process within the environmental impact assessment.
So again, when we look at your impact appraisal, we need to bear in mind that not all of the impacts and not all the costs have been monetised and included.
In the socio-economic CBA, you are correct. Air quality and noise are not included within that because they have not been judged as significant effects by other parts of the assessment.
Right. That's when you say not significant. That's because they're judged to be not significant in the environmental statement.
That is correct, I believe.
Right. Does it necessarily follow that because of the way something is judged to be significant or not significant in environmental statement appraisal terms, that it has no economic value, no economic cost?
It does not mean it has no economic cost, no, but it would it gets to the point that it would seem disproportionate to consider it because the effect is unlikely to be of a significant order of magnitude to change the assessment.
How do you know that, Mr. Brass, if you've not done the exercise?
That's a fair point. We haven't done the exercise in terms of those costs, but we've gone back to guidance and looked at this and said ultimately, as WebTake has set out and as I've set out in my rebuttal proof, that if the air quality and noise impacts are not expected to be significant, then a proportional approach should be taken and should not necessarily be included within the socio-economic CBA. Simple as that.
All right, thank you. That's all I need to ask you about that. Now, the last point I've got for you, Mr. Ciro, it starts, I think, on page 54 of his proof at 6.5.7 and goes over to page 55, and he talks about the testing relating to the fast and slow forecasts.
Yes.
And he takes a point, doesn't he, in relation to the slow forecasts, that because discounting is applied in calculation of NPV, if the economic benefits are realised later, then the net present value of the benefits will be further reduced.
Yes, that would be correct. That if my benefits are realised later, then they would be slightly lower due to the discounting effect.
Yeah. Again.
Similarly.
Sorry.
I
don't want to cut across you, so please finish your answer.
No. Sorry. All I was going to say is similarly, cost and benefits would obviously be reduced. Similarly, as we've discussed it a number of times, in relation to environmental effects, they would of course also be lower.
Mm-hmm. So, have you done any analysis of the slow growth scenario that you've produced to see the extent to which the discounting reduces the benefit in net present value terms?
It makes a limited effect. It reduces it by about somewhere between around 8%, I think it is. We did look at it briefly, but we have not included it.
Sorry, can you just give me that percentage again, because I didn't quite catch it.
I'm going to withdraw that because I can't actually remember off the top of my head. We know that if you moved everything back by about 4 years, it will reduce it by, I think it'll work out somewhere around 10%, but I'd have to run it properly.
All right.
So I'd have to run it properly to be sure.
Okay, but fine. That's all I need. Thank you very much indeed. I'll just check and make sure there's nothing else. Right, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Brass. That's all the questions I've got.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Mr. Young, you're on mute.
Thank you, Mr. Brass. Right. In terms of I can't quite see who we got in the room there in terms of other advocates, but I'm assuming Mr. Morehouse is with us. And Mr. Morehouse, are you wanting to cross-examine Mr. Brass?
Yes, please.
Right. In that case, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. Mr. Browse, I just want to start, if we can, on the observation that you've just been making about the importance or otherwise of the tag analysis.
Yes.
The tag analysis is a transport analysis, tag 5.2, specifically for aviation appraisals.
Yeah.
So far as those aviation appraisals are concerned, the tag guidance you will have heard, and we can go to it if you want. Paragraph 1.1.3 of the aviation appraisal. This is, if people want to see it, it's document 1108.
1108. All right. Yes, I know we've been there before, but let's just make sure I know what I'm talking about. Sorry, which paragraph, Mr. Morehouse?
Paragraph 1.1.3.
Yes.
Now, just before we look at that, the tag unit is applicable to all aviation appraisals, isn't it?
It's applicable to public sector interventions in the aviation market. That is not all appraisals now.
Okay, well, we'll come on to that, but it doesn't, for example, define the appraisal by whether or not it's a public or private proposal.
It makes quite clear that its primary user is DFT, and its primary purpose, as it is derived ultimately from Green Book, is in relation to public sector interventions.
It doesn't distinguish between whether or not an airport is, for example, a large airport like Heathrow Airport or a smaller one like Bristol.
Not as far as I can remember, no.
And we can see there that at paragraph 1.1.3 that the unit is expected to apply to the appraisal of most government interventions, and I can skip out a bit, which include many regulations and the approach to planning applications for individual schemes.
That's what it says, yes. I think I'd make it sorry,
No, please clarify. You may be answering my next question.
Okay. I mean, what I was going to say is, ultimately, is what we're involved in here is not a government intervention. What we're talking about here is, and I think that sentence needs to be read quite carefully, when it refers to the approach to planning applications for individual schemes, those are relating to government interventions. What they're referring to is circumstances where central government or a local government or a government agency is making some form of planning application in the aviation arena. It could be because they own an airport and they wish to examine it from that perspective, or they may be wishing to make some sort of other form of intervention in relation to the airport, building a skills academy or something of that nature. It doesn't refer to a private sector investment.
So far as the scheme is concerned, would you say it applied, or it would apply if, for example, there was a road widening scheme associated with the development?
Mr. Morehouse, I think you're heading towards the A38, I believe. I would say that the A38 is a publicly funded scheme, which the airport happens to be next to. There are elements of it around road junctions, I understand it. I'm not a transport expert, so I cannot comment on the detail, but I believe those elements which relate to the airport are paid for by the airport.
I'd like to move on to the question of the things that I think you've conceded ought to have been considered or would have been considered as part of a tag appraisal in cross-examination by my learned friend, Mr. Taylor.
Which items are you referring to specifically?
The first of them is the question of carbon, and I wonder whether or not you can have a look at CD 2.22.
CD 2.2 is the Economic Impact Assessment Addendum, is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And if you have CD 2.22, I'd invite your attention to the table at page 40 of 46 on the PDF pages. It's table figure 4.2.
4.2. Yes, I have it.
There is the set out is the what is described as the socio-economic cost-benefit analysis with
Yes.
offsetting carbon emissions. I think my learned friend Mr. Taylor's just been asking you about things that aren't on there, such as noise and other factors. But just looking at carbon for a moment, if we have a look at carbon costs, we see there that a figure of 262 million has been ascribed to that.
Correct.
That's assuming a central carbon figure, not a high carbon figure.
That is correct. It is set out on page 35 and the bullet point at the top.
And a high carbon figure, rather than being 262 million, would be in the order of 459.7 million, wouldn't it? I can assist
On
you.
average, I think. Sorry, I could do with a calculator, but if you could tell me your calculation, I will make a judgment whether that's correct or not.
I'm now looking at the statement of Dr. Chapman, his proof of evidence.
I can't accept Dr. Chapman's figure because obviously he's a slightly. I mean, I know we've come out at that base point of slightly different, slightly similar figures. Well, in fact, very similar figures.
Okay. Well, let's have a look at them anyway.
It would be around, from memory, I'd say higher carbon costs are about 1.6 times higher than core carbon costs on the whole. Yeah. So if you multiply that by about 1.6, you could probably get somewhere near.
Yeah. So if we look at his proof of evidence, paragraph 9.3.9.
All right, give me just a moment. 9.3.9. Yes.
We can see there set out the Bristol expansion central carbon prices 298.5 million. I think that's slightly different to the figure that's in your cost benefit, but very similar.
Quite close.
And with a high price 459.7 million.
Yes.
We also know, don't we, that it is recommended that when modelling costs so far as carbon are concerned and greenhouse gas emissions are concerned, that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy gives advice that that figure ought to have a multiplier of 1.9.
I think you're sort of speeding into areas around climate change, which I would not claim to be an expert on, Mr. Morehouse. I have taken the quantity of carbon assessed from Mr. Ocean Ireland's assessment of climate change assessment for the application. All I have done at that point is simply monetize that using monetary values of carbon. I'm not really able to comment on issues around the quantum of carbon included.
You've monetized it at the average rate, not the higher rate.
I've had to, as it says in the document, it's at the core rate. Yes.
And you accept that the higher rate is what we ought to be looking at as a starting point?
I accept, well, I understand that more recent guidance has suggested that we should be looking at the higher rate in terms of web tag and things, or something. They are heading in that direction. Obviously, this is not a web tag appraisal. It was done on central prices.
I'm thinking of the Department for Transport's recent guidance on this, that is how it ought to be monetised.
Well, I mean, I would say that that is, as I understand it, that piece of guidance is in relation to web tag, which I've already explained is not a relevant standard here. I would also note that the Jet Zero consultation appears to still be using core carbon values in options. I can't remember if they're called options 1 or 2, but the first 2 of their pathways to net zero. And it's only in the 3rd and 4th that they are considering higher carbon costs.
Do you accept that the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, their guidance is applicable?
In what form, Mr. Morehouse? Applicable to what?
On how to quantify greenhouse gas emissions.
If I'm quantifying the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, i.e. how much carbon there is, I'm afraid it's not an issue I can comment on.
Because if you multiply by a factor of 1.9 the figure that we have, the higher carbon price of 459 million, we reach a figure of 869 million as the cost of carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions.
Mr. Morehouse, mathematically, I am sure you are correct, but as I have just stated, I am dealing with socioeconomics. The quantum of emissions, i.e. how many tons of carbon there is not something I can comment on.
Well, the socioeconomic impact of the scheme includes the carbon price. You accept that? You've put that in your...
The socioeconomic impact of this scheme, that I have set, it includes the carbon assessment undertaken as part of the overall environmental impact assessment, which I have then monetised.
And you should...
As to whether other things should be in that carbon assessment is not an area I can comment on.
You accept it should be at the higher rate?
I don't know that I do accept it. I'm not undertaking web tag appraisal here, as I very clearly stated, and therefore we have presented what is a central case estimate of the carbon assessment that's been done as part of the environmental impact assessment. I've gone no further than that.
Okay, so we can agree you haven't then taken that into account, the Department
of
Business.
We can certainly agree that I have not produced a higher carbon cost sensitivity.
And you haven't taken into account...
We can also agree that I think that the higher carbon costs are about 1.6 times higher than the core case.
1.9, yeah.
1.6.
Okay.
1.9, I believe, is the non-CO2 factor you're talking about.
You're correct. But you accept that you haven't taken into account the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy suggestion that it should be a multiplier of 1.9?
I have not personally, but as I said, I'm not commenting on the quantum to be considered here.
Okay. And you haven't taken into account noise or air quality issues?
No, as I've just explained to Mr. Taylor, web tag guidance, if you want to look at web tag guidance, is quite clear on this, actually. There is a degree of proportionality that has to be taken into account. This is a relatively small scheme. The broader assessment that's been done as part of the environmental impact assessment has found that those two items are not a significant impact, and we have not therefore included them within the socioeconomic CBA.
Turning now to a different subject, business passengers.
Yes.
I'd invite you to have a look, if you would please, to Dr. Chapman's rebuttal statement, and in particular the information contained at paragraph 2.1.6, which is the civil aviation figures.
Yes, let me just read it, Mr. Morehouse, and I can remind myself of what it said. Okay.
This, of course, comes with a health warning that we don't have figures for Bristol, but these are figures for Gatwick, Heathrow, Luton, Manchester and Stansted. And we can see there, can't we, that between 2006 and 2019, in real terms, in real passenger travel, there has been a collective drop from 32 million to just under 30 million.
Yes, that is what the graph says, yes. Okay.
So,
as you say, it's a very, very partial view of the world. It only includes 5 airports, 3 of which could reasonably be said to be constrained. It doesn't cover Bristol, and I think I have to say I think it's of limited relevance.
Yeah. You've not been able to advance figures, and it's not a criticism, for Bristol from 2006 to 2019 to compare, have you?
Well, as the data simply does not exist, because the CAA passenger survey data was just simply not done at Bristol. Unfortunately, none of us can advance that data. It just doesn't exist.
I just want to make the point, I think, in your evidence to Mr. Rube and Taylor earlier on, you said that the numbers of passengers had fallen as a percentage, not as a total number. On those figures, they've fallen as total numbers, haven't they?
Well, I mean, I believe I was speaking specifically about Heathrow, which is obviously only one of those in there. And I did caveat with the point with I would actually have to go away and check. Unfortunately, I cannot remember off the top of my head, I'm afraid, the business component of every single airport in the UK.
So the fact is that figures for business aviation haven't yet reached the level pre the economic downturn in 2008.
We don't know. We can't tell. We've only got 5 airports there. We just simply don't know.
You don't provide any evidence to contradict it.
I think it would be a very, very difficult thing to do, frankly, at the end of the day. CAA passenger surveys are great. They're absolutely brilliant for some things, but as we've all noted over the last week or so, they are not perfect because they don't cover every airport and they don't cover every airport every year. Your only other option is the International Passenger Survey, which clearly for a start doesn't include domestic travel, which is, in terms of business travel, is actually very important for regional airports, particularly in terms of being able to travel to other parts of the UK. And even that has been subject sort of to changes over time. Particularly, I think I'm right in saying around 2009 the methodology was changed. So even considering that over time, it's really quite difficult.
Do you accept that if those figures are indicative of what is going on in the country, that it would demonstrate a break between the connection between economic growth and business passenger travel?
Mr. Morris, I'm afraid I can't answer that because I can't accept the premise of your question. There's not enough there to go on to be able to answer. It would be unfair of me and inaccurate and may well mislead the inquiry to actually comment further. We have literally got 5 airports. It doesn't tell us.
Do you accept that the airport itself has no control over the direct control over the routes that are flown from it?
It has limited. It depends. It has contractual arrangements with individual airlines, which could and indeed do on occasions include individual routes. To say they have no direct control would not be entirely true, no. But clearly, if a route is not viable, no, someone's not going to fly it, and the airport can't make them.
Yeah. And so far as business travel is concerned from Bristol Airport, we've seen, have we not, from the aircraft, the proposed or the anticipated fleet mixes, that no wide-body jets fly from Bristol, do they?
Yes, they do. Sorry, I need to find the fleet mix and I can point them.
Wide-body jets?
So 787 Dreamliner is a wide-body jet.
For most purposes, the runway isn't long enough, is it, for most jets?
It depends on the long-haul aircraft you're talking about. I mean, a 787, yes, has very good runway performance, and yes, it could. It kind of does operate from Bristol. You would have more difficulty with, say, a Boeing 767 or indeed a 777 as well. But those are relatively old aircraft types. We would, if someone was operating a long-haul service, which I presume is where you're going with this, from Bristol, they would odds on really operating more modern aircraft like a 787.
Moving on to the issue of job creation, employment.
Yes.
There has been quite a lot of discussion, and I'm not intending to go over it again or questions about the levelling up policy, but I do want to invite your attention to the economic impact assessment. This is CD 2.08. And
Sorry, I'm just having to find through my piles of paper. I do apologise. Right, yes, which page?
2.08, page 48 on the PDF version, which is page 40 on the printed version, and it's figure 4.3.
Yes.
So this shows the employment distribution currently at Bristol Airport, or at the time of the application, I think.
2017, but yes.
And so this represents the position, well, it says on there, the date of it is 2017.
It is, yes.
And we know, don't we, that there have been previous planning applications in relation to Bristol Airport.
Yes.
And if we have a look at paragraph, it may be we want to keep this page if people can, but CD 4.022, which is the Section 106 agreement from the 2011 application.
Sorry, excuse me. So 4.022, did you say?
4.02.2. And if you can turn to PDF page 43, it's the printed page 41 of that document.
I'm not entirely sure I've got the right place, but let's... So what was the PDF page was?
PDF 43.
43, sorry. Right, yes.
We can see there that this is part of the Section 106 agreements and Part 4 obligations relating to employment.
Yes, I can see that, yes.
So we can read there, can't we, that in 2011, to submit within 12 months of the commencement of the development for approval by the Council a skills and employment plan developed in conjunction with West at Work.
Sorry, yeah.
That's a very...
Oh, sorry, yes, sorry, I misheard you. No, it's fine, sorry, carry on.
1.1, a profile of the employment opportunities. 1.2, a marketing communication strategy to raise awareness of the airport employment opportunities. 1.3, a community engagement strategy. 1.4, engagement with the local employment schemes to maximize opportunities for local people to benefit from employment opportunities.
Yes.
1.5, a young persons program to promote employment and training opportunities through schools, education providers and organizations. 1.6, yes. Engagement with people from disadvantaged areas or backgrounds in the local community.
Yes.
Training programs for potential employees, engagement with partner companies, identification of key performance indicators to measure the success of the plan, and arrangements for monitoring the success of the plan. So that was what was put in place as the 106 agreement back in 2011. Yes?
Yes.
And the aim of that, even though it probably wasn't called it then, it was aimed at what we might nowadays call a government policy of levelling up, targeting deprived areas, wasn't it?
Having not been involved in it, I can't really comment on exactly what the aims were, no, but certainly the types of measures you were looking at there would be, I would have thought, in line with that sort of thing, yes. But unfortunately, I wasn't involved in that. I can't really comment on further than that. But carry on.
I'm not going to go to it, but we could compare that readily with what's being proposed in this scheme, which is far less targeted and far less specific, isn't it?
I think it's different. I mean, it is different. I think, but I'm not sure you can say it's less targeted.
Okay. If we go,
that's a matter of perception rather than anything else. I think it's set out differently, and there are different measures within the skills and employment plan now. But the fact they're set out differently, I don't think changes that particularly.
Okay, Mr. Bartok, we can all read it, so I'm not going to debate it with you.
No, that's fine.
If we go back to figure the economic assessment document, this is the 2.08 at page 48 and the plan.
So are we all still on figure 4.3, the heat map?
This is CD 2.08, this is the York Aviation Economic Impact Plan.
I've
Figure,
got that.
figure 4.3. And
Yes,
we can see there the places of employment for people, can't we?
We can.
So presumably the 106 agreement was implemented.
I'm assuming so, yes.
Okay. And we can see there, if we look at for example, just looking at Western-super-Mare and bearing in mind the idea that we're supposed to be levelling up deprived areas, we can see there for Western-super-Mare, the northern part of Western-super-Mare is has the highest employment, can't we? The red areas.
Yes, I would say so. It's a little. I suppose the map's obviously quite old and not great, but yes, I would. I'd say it's more central.
Yeah, but we'll agree that the south and west areas of Bourneville Estate, for example, which is the most deprived area, or amongst the most deprived areas, that give the area its levelling up difficulties, much lower employment.
As things stood back in 2017, it would certainly appear that the employment density around there is lower. I mean, that's based on postcode data. That particular map is actually based on postcode data. So in some ways, there is clearly a concentration further, slightly to the north of there, but I would say there's still jobs in those areas. But yes, there is a greater concentration to the north by the looks of it, yes.
And again, if we look at South Bristol, I mean, you're aware South Bristol, as all areas, has relatively affluent areas and areas of deprivation. Yes, and those in the middle. Yeah. And so if we look at the employment, we can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, it's concentrated around the A38 and those areas where people can presumably drive or get the bus.
Yes, I think that appears to be so. Yes, I mean,
I'm not. Maybe you don't know the area, but it doesn't look like there's very much employment, for example, in Knoll West or in Hartcliffe, the areas of large social deprivation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm trying to look at a very small scale map, but no, I think your comment is right, but I think the point is that the airport is providing. Was providing employment in those locations. Future growth, we're talking about the future here, really. We're talking about future growth and whether the airport can make a difference in those areas. And I think what we're looking at here is a skills and employment plan and a series of transport interventions that are aiming to help the airport to attract more people to into work from those areas. I mean, in some ways, that's part of the point. If we're not getting enough now, then it would make sense to continue to try to do so. And the other thing, a certain amount of caution is needed around heat maps. Ultimately, we are talking about quite a large employment centre, and you are going to get concentrations in places of high population density. It does not necessarily mean you're not having an effect in other areas. You clearly are. We can see that the people are coming from those areas. It's plain as day on the map. They may not be the biggest concentrations, but they are providing employment in those areas.
We've heard your answers in relation to that. I think anything else that I say may be deemed comment rather than questioning. So far as your economic impact assessments are concerned, your overall assessment, would you agree that you haven't conducted any sensitivity testing on them?
I would agree. No, I mean, I wouldn't agree with that because we have conducted sensitivity testing on what we regard as the most sensitive variable, which is the point of time at which you reach 12 million passengers per annum. We've looked at the faster growth scenario, we've looked at the slower growth scenario, and we've considered what they would do to the results of the economic impact assessment. We haven't quantified those, as you know, simply because we don't believe that would make a significant difference to the results of the assessment.
So the sensitivity you have looked at is fast and slow growth?
That is correct.
And nothing else?
No, I mean, we haven't looked at anything else from that perspective, no. What we've tried to do is come up with a sensible central case assessment which enables decision making.
Do you agree that that's not best practice?
No, I don't agree that that's not best practice.
You're happy leaving that degree of uncertainty without factoring in any other of the sensitivity issues?
I would say there is always uncertainty, ultimately. What we're trying to do is put forward a case which is a reasonable central case. That is what we've done and what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Mr. Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Norris.
Okay, well, I think we're finished with you, Mr. Brass.
Thank you, Mr. Young.
Well done on your efforts. Now, I'm just looking to my colleague in the room just to tell me whether there's any issues that have cropped up that we need to deal with, or whether you want to set out the program going.
There is one issue, but before we get there, I think you've forgotten re-examination.
Oh, I do beg your pardon, Mr. Humphreys.
It's all right, sir. I was sitting quietly, but probably not for much longer.
Apologies, do carry on.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I'm going to broadly take things, Mr. Brass, in kind of chronological or temporal, I suppose, order. So I'm going to start with some points from Mr. Taylor. And early on, he took you to some high-level points about cost-benefit analysis. He returned to that much later, but he started off with that, and he took you to the economic impact assessment addendum, which we have as CD 2.22, and he took you to figure 4.1, which is on page 39. So could we look at that first?
You can.
And you were asked a number of questions that compared that figure with the equivalent one, which I won't ask you to look up, but the equivalent one in the original economic assessment. I'll give the reference just so the inspectors can note it, which is CD 2.8, PDF page 67. And you were asked about in effect, the differences and why the net present value had reduced. And can I just get you to look at your paragraphs 4.14 and 4.15 in the Economic Impact Assessment Addendum. So that's on PDF page 40. And just take the inspectors through the reasons why the number has declined and what the appropriate comparison between the two sets of figures would be.
Mr. Humphreys, you're quite right. I mean, as we've explained in 4.14, the primary difference between the NPV assessment in the original economic impact assessment and the one in the economic impact assessment is the inclusion of carbon costs within the assessment, which was requested and suggested by North Somerset Council, I believe. That additional cost is obviously a fairly significant cost, and I think, as we've explained previously, we do have some concerns about the inclusion of that cost, given the potential for carbon leakage and indeed the fact that carbon pricing is internalised within the air traffic forecasting model as well. That has reduced the NPV by about between 262 million and make sure I get my figures right, 305 million. that means that the original NPV is not on the same basis as the new NPV. On a like-for-like basis, the difference is around, the new figure would be around £1.1 billion of NPV benefit. But that would still that's still affected by the additional 4 years of discounting within the assessment.
And then you were asked questions, and it was put to you, well, this was all very different from what was in front of officers, and therefore the committee. When this went before committee, did the officers, and indeed Jacobs, who were advising at that time, simply take your figures at face value, or was anything else done?
No. I mean, Jacobs subjected the figures of all of our figures to scrutiny. They did some of their own work on displacement in terms of GVA and employment impacts, and those were presented within the officers' report. And they reached their conclusions based on, I believe, their own assessment, which took that additional displacement off our numbers that they thought was appropriate, and then still came to the conclusion that the scheme offers significant economic benefits.
Thank you. I'll move on then to a slightly different topic. You were then asked about business productivity, and there were a series of questions first that related to Mr. Sirrett's balanced case and elasticities, and what would happen if business passengers in a constrained airport kind of force their way through. First of all, before we come to that, just explain the way in which both the growth model and the allocation models that you've told us about, how they forecast growth in business travel, and how the elasticities are used.
The elasticities are used to consider underlying demand. So they, based on sort of economic growth, obviously, as we've discussed, and the effect on airfares over time, things like carbon prices and fuel and similar, the elasticities produce the overall pool of demand that will be flying from the catchment area. The allocation model then considers how that demand is fulfilled at different airports across the catchment area. In the unconstrained scenario, where Bristol is able to grow beyond its planning cap, we don't apply anything to try and constrain that demand. We don't, and that's what gets us to around 14%. In the constrained world, what we have to do is we apply what's called a shadow price on top of Bristol's existing costs, which forces people away from the airport, and hence we get the distribution that we get. Our analysis at the end of that day is that actually that had very little effect on the proportion of business travel. It all still came out at around 14%. I think we also, at that point, considered what constraint does to make sure that we felt that what was coming out was rational, which is the discussion we had around what are the most revenue-intensive routes at regional airports in the UK. Ultimately, they tend towards high-volume leisure routes, which are highly profitable for the airlines. More marginal city routes, which may be of more use to business travel, do have a tendency to be priced out. And this is precisely what the effect that we've been seeing at Heathrow as well in recent years. As the airport has been extremely full, airlines have tried to make the best use of slots that they can. They have switched from domestic or short-haul services, for instance, towards long-haul services, which have larger planes, more seats, more people, and therefore they can make more revenue off them.
Now, early on in that answer, you explained that one of the ways in which you model the constrained airport is in effect to assume a higher a higher cost, as I understand it. Have I understood that correctly?
Yes.
And what does that mean, a higher cost? Is that a sort of higher price of flying?
It could be. I mean, it's what's called a generalised cost. It could be a convenience thing, or it could be a higher airfare. It could be. It's just harder to get to the airport because it's more constrained. It could be there's a lack of frequency because it's not developed, so people are having to wait longer between flights. It could just be a higher airfare. It could be a range of different things, but it's an overall function that pushes people away from the airport.
Let's assume in the constrained airport there is a particular cost of flying that reflects that range of different things, and a certain number of business passengers who have less sensitive to price, certain number of business passengers are willing to fly at that price. We'll call it, X million
Yes.
passengers. If the constraint is removed and there is expansion to 12 million passengers, and that generalized cost reflecting that range of things falls, what would you expect to happen to the number of business passengers?
I would expect the number of business passengers to increase, but that would not necessarily change the proportion of business passengers.
Right. Would you expect, in those circumstances, the number of business passengers to remain exactly the same as is implicit in Mr. Stewart's balance case? In other words, there is no net improvement.
Yeah, I mean, it would be unlikely that there'll be no difference at all. No.
What does that tell us then broadly about the behaviour of passengers and the likelihood of Mr. Stewart's balanced case, where both in a constrained airport and in then an unconstrained airport where prices have fallen, the numbers of business passengers remain exactly the same? There's no net benefit.
It would be unlikely that would happen. I mean, ultimately, the additional convenience, the lower cost, would drive more business passengers.
You were also, not at exactly that point, but at a slightly different point in the cross-examination about this type of point taken to the Heathrow data and to the concept that in a constrained airport the number of passengers would go up, and you drew attention to those that particular figure in your evidence that relates to the response of airlines to constraint on slots. How does that type of point relate to the point that was again just being put to you, this idea that a constrained airport, you'll have a certain number of business passengers, but if you unconstrain it, you reduce the price, you have no more business passengers?
I mean, it's a demonstration from of evidence we can see from the supply side and the demand side, in fact, if you're thinking about Heathrow as well, that that's simply not the case. That in a constrained world, what will happen is airlines will not put on the relevant routes that business passengers want in UK regional airports, because they won't be able to, they're going to profit maximise. They're going to try and make as much money as they can off the limited resources that they have. If you're unconstrained, then you can start to not only do those things, but do other things, and that's when you start to add on new routes, as well, which are potentially more useful for business travellers. So you would expect them to actually see a big increase in business travellers from that regard. And again, as I've explained already, that's exactly what's happening at Heathrow at the moment, in my view. There's a constraint on Heathrow, as we all know about. There's a switch towards these longer haul services because it is better for the airlines. Also, they can make more money out of their individual slots on those services than they can on domestic and short haul services. And that is leading to relatively fewer, a decline in business percentage at Heathrow Airport. If you release that constraint, you really will potentially begin to see growth at the airport again and growth in business travel.
And then turning to Mr. Sirat's optimistic view, which you were taken to next, we can see what the basis for that is if we look at his proof of evidence at page 24, paragraph 4.3.12.
Yes.
And this is his approach, which is based on the differential growth rates. And he assumes, as in his table 4.2, the top of page 25,
yes,
half the growth in business passengers, and therefore we can see in table 4.3, assumes in his optimistic case half the amount of benefit from business productivity. And again, what does that tell us about his views on the relationship between growth in business passengers and the benefits from business productivity?
It tells us that he accepts that relationship exists. He accepts that if business passengers grow if both of our best business passengers grew by the same amount, then we would get the same business productivity benefits.
And you were then taken to questions on displacement,
yes,
and a table that we've now looked at a couple of times. Indeed, Mr. Morehouse has just taken you to it. So CD 2.8, that's the original York Aviation report. And I'll get you to look again at figure 4.3. This is on PDF page 48.
I have it.
Firstly, what does this tell us in broad terms about the principal locations where employees actually live?
Quite clearly, it shows that the principal locations for employment are Weston-super-Mare and Bristol.
And you made the point, it's very difficult to know precisely within those areas where people are coming from, but does that tell you anything in broad terms about accessibility from those areas to the airport, whether it be by private transport or public transport?
No, it doesn't. It tells you that people are able to get there clearly. Well, in that case, it does. Yes, it does tell you that people are able to get from those areas to the airport. Yes.
What we do know is that Bristol Airport, we can see it on the plan, is a few miles away from Bristol. You've been asked a number of questions about Cardiff Airport.
Yeah.
Do you know how far away from Cardiff is Cardiff Airport?
I do not, off the top of my head, but I believe it is. I think it's a reasonable distance, but I don't know to be sure, I'm afraid.
I've got it in front of me on Google Maps. Cardiff Airport is not actually in Cardiff, it's the other side of Barry. It's about, 13 miles from Cardiff, and it's in Vale of Glamorgan district. Now, you were asked, and we'll put something in to demonstrate all that, I mean, it's just a question of fact. You were asked about Cardiff and its level within the government's list of levelling up, but Cardiff Airport is not in Cardiff, it's in Vale of Glamorgan. I don't suppose you happen to know either what level Vale of Glamorgan is.
I'm afraid I do not. No,
Okay.
I have not
Well,
memorised the list.
We'll put it in. It's level 2, the same as North Somerset. Now, in that context, those are just facts. In that context, what do you make of this debate that we should be displacing growth that wants to go to Bristol Airport to try to get it to go to Cardiff Airport in the Vale of Glamorgan in order to achieve some sort of levelling up agenda?
Well, as they are apparently at the same level, there would seem to be no issue in terms of levelling up.
And you were then asked a series of questions, again, in the context of displacement, about why certain numbers of passengers, if Bristol is constrained, why they would go to Heathrow or indeed Gatwick. And you've already touched on the point about the number of, or the proportion of business passengers at Heathrow declining. So far as you know, does Heathrow have leisure, holiday destinations to locations in France?
I believe so, yes.
Spain?
Yes.
Portugal?
I believe so, yes.
Italy?
Yes.
Greece?
Yes.
Canaries?
Yes, indeed.
Balearic Islands?
I believe so, yes.
Cyprus?
Yes.
Malta? I mean, I think someone
Yes.
mentioned Ibiza last night. I think the flight to Ibiza went off at almost 1:30 today, or one of the flights to Ibiza. What do you say about this proposition that in some way, if Bristol Airport is constrained, some people won't go to Heathrow or indeed Gatwick or the other airports that you mentioned?
It's just, it's nonsensical. We can already see it happening. I think we've already looked at various pie charts of it, which show the market shares of the different airports in the southwest. Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton, all of them serve a large number of destinations, including many, many leisure destinations at relatively high frequencies on different days of the week that are convenient to people. Heathrow, yes, is slightly more expensive. A lot of the others offer very good low-cost services. There's no reason why people would not go to these airports. They're a perfectly valid choice, and the data we have tells us that they're going there now.
And then, still on displacement, you were asked about Mr. Sirot's tables, and you were taken to the most recent revisions, and table 6.3. That's the table that looks sort of like that. It's a landscape.
One moment. Yes, I'm there.
Let's just understand this table and what it's telling us. Look first at the column headed net additional impact from expansion.
Yeah. Yes.
You have the GVA jobs and FTE figures for 3 geographic areas, which concentrically get larger and larger. So you have the North Somerset figures, and then west of England, do those include North Somerset?
I believe so.
Yep. And southwest and South Wales, do those also include West of England?
I believe so.
Yes. So if you wanted to understand the numbers of jobs, and these are obviously direct, indirect, and induced jobs, in South West and South Wales, but excluding West of England, do you just simply take the second row from the bottom row?
Yes, I believe that would be the case, I think.
So just explain to the inspectors what once you take into account not just direct but indirect and induced employment from expansion at Bristol, what that is doing for the wider area outside North Somerset, outside even the west of England, what sort of effect is being had in terms of jobs?
That is where most of the benefit is going.
Yeah. Will some of those be in South Wales?
Yes, some of them will be.
Look also at what happens if the airport is constrained. We can see that depending on the area you look at, some jobs will now go to areas around Cardiff Airport. But what also happens? What happens to other airports outside South Wales and the southwest?
They are also having increases in jobs in GBA. They're experiencing greater economic benefit from that. There is displacement outside of that area.
If one was trying to improve employment in Cardiff, or in more accurately, actually, probably Barry and Aberthaw and the areas in Vale of Glamorgan, is constraining Bristol Airport a particularly efficient way of doing it?
No. It's not a very efficient way of doing it at all. Most of what you would be trying to achieve is going elsewhere, in other parts of the country.
Is there any government policy or regional policy that says we should be trying to do that? I displace employment from North Somerset or the west of England in order to thereby benefit other areas?
Not that I'm aware of.
And then you were asked about those people who, if Bristol Airport is constrained, may not fly at all. And you said some of them may spend their money on goods made overseas or other things that are in effect imports. But what about people who buy something that is made in just a completely different part of the UK? Is that a benefit? Is that a benefit to the people in North Somerset or the west of England?
No, from that point of view, I mean, if we're talking about the study area, in fact, imports are not just overseas imports, there'll be imports from the rest of the UK as well.
Again, in policy terms, is there anything that directs us to forego the direct, indirect, and induced jobs which you and Mr. Ciro have agreed will come forward with the expansion of Bristol Airport, for the chance that some other jobs may come forward either elsewhere in Europe or elsewhere in the UK, or possibly in the local area? Again, is there anything that directs us that we should be doing that?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And then we we moved on slightly, but within similar themes to Junction 21 and the enterprise area, and the hope that there might be some 9,000 jobs there. Does the airport have any relevance to the success of that objective?
Yes, it does.
How?
Ultimately, the global take a step back, Junction 21 enterprise area is aimed at global and national companies to come and locate in North Somerset. Global and national companies have a tendency to want to actually get to places like their original head offices, or possibly they're not the markets they serve elsewhere outside of North Somerset. So the connectivity provided by the airport is potentially essential to attracting companies to work at Junction 21. As a point I think I made was that these are our inward investors. The role of airports in attracting inward investors is well recognised and well documented. It's very reasonable to say that some of those jobs at Junction 21, should when they come forward, will be related to the connectivity provided by the airport.
Move on again, slightly different point now. We're still on jobs, but you were taken to points relating to skills and employment and whether local people would be able to get the jobs, and you were taken to points relating to the Section 106 agreement. Can I just get you to look at the officer's report? So that's CD 4.11.
A moment. Okay.
And get you to turn to page 33.
I'm there.
And about halfway down, there's a passage that says, in the context of mitigating construction and operational phase skills concerns arising from the proposal, officers therefore recommend planning obligations within a Section 106 legal agreement should include, and then a list of things: operational phase, employment support fund, educational program, local labour agreement, and various things like that. And then at the end of the list, on the next page, BAL have agreed in principle to these requirements. So insofar as you're taken to those various themes, what is your understanding in terms of where the request came from for those particular things?
It came from North Somerset Council. The council has essentially set out what they would like to see within the skills and employment plan.
And in relation to transport and public transport improvements as well, maybe outside your area, but were there, so far as you know, discussions between the council and BAL as to what the council was seeking?
I don't have detailed knowledge of it, but that is my understanding, yes.
And then in this context of local people taking jobs, and you were asked questions about, precisely how many people from particular areas in Weston-super-Mare or parts of South Bristol would take jobs in 2030.
Yes.
Is it possible or even appropriate to try to estimate precise numbers of individuals or GVA in 2030 relating to local residents and who will take what jobs? Is that?
No, it's not a situation we can possibly know. Ultimately, it's 10 years in the future. We don't even know how big the population will be at that point in time. We have our population projections at West of England level, at Southwest level. We can't sensibly assess how many people might be living in different parts of Western-super-Mare and South Bristol over that period. We cannot make a reasoned judgment on that.
And then we came to Mr. Morehouse, who asked questions. He, for obvious reasons, asked questions about the web tag theme, if I can
Yes.
put it like that, and the recent web tag update, I think they're called, which indicates that government should look at high carbon prices. Firstly, does that guidance to government relate to you or your appraisals of this particular?
No, it doesn't. No.
But how does the Monte Carlo model take into account carbon prices?
It's an excellent point. As we know from our discussions around traffic forecasting at the end of the day, within the Monte Carlo model, we do look at high carbon prices in terms of our scenarios, and they are reflected in the airfares that are assumed to be paid by passengers within that model. And in that sense, those higher carbon prices are already internalised within the demand that we see, which is moved on through then to the socio-economic impact assessment.
And then Mr. Morehouse took you to that figure in Dr. Chapman's rebuttal, is sort of just below paragraph 2.1.6. It's on page 3 of the rebuttal. And the point that's been put on a number of occasions is that the percentage of business passengers at those airports is falling, and it was put to you that, was there any evidence for Bristol? So can we just look first of all at the document INQ 13? That's the one where we looked at the passenger growth rates. It's Mr. Foley's.
Yes, just one moment. Let me just find it. Sorry, I'll just be a moment. IQ 13. I have it.
And we can see there in the top half of the figure, and this sort of first under the dates, the first line of data is passenger numbers in thousands.
Yes.
What does that tell you? What should that tell the inspectors about the levels of business passengers at Bristol Airport over that period?
It tells you that over the period, the level of business travellers has risen and has continued to rise. It is not the same trend that you can see within Dr. Chapman's graph.
And we know from the discussions that there was a particular feature of 2019 that affected business passengers. Had that not occurred, what would you have expected the numbers to have been, in broad terms, I don't mean precise numbers, but in what direction?
I would have expected the number of business passengers listed there for 2019 at 1.1 million roughly to be higher. The percentage of business which is expressed in 2019 at 14%, I would have expected to be higher. As you alluded to, Mr. Chambers, it's very hard to know exactly what it would have been. But given the extent of Flybe's operations, sorry, not Flybe, BMI Regional's operations at Bristol, and that they were a significant carrier of business traffic at the airport, I would expect it to be significantly more.
And again, you know, it was put to you that we don't have information for Bristol. Could I again invite you to take up your forecasting proof of evidence? And turn to, for those with the PDF page 53, for those with the physical document page 52, I want to draw your attention to figure 14. Again, what is that telling you? Should it be telling us about?
It's
Bristol?
showing you an uptrend at Bristol over time. There's obviously the 2012 number, which we as we've discussed, was affected by the global financial crisis, but there is a long run trend upwards in terms of business traffic at Bristol.
So really, what weight, if any, should the inspectors put on the data for Gatwick, Heathrow, Luton, Manchester and Stansted in Dr. Chapman's rebuttal?
None. It doesn't tell you anything about Bristol.
Thank you. Mr. Brass, thank you very much. Those are all the questions I've got for you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Humphries. Thank you, everyone.
Well done again, Mr. Brass.
Thank you, Mr. Young.
Okay, Mr. Ware, anything?
Yeah, I've just got one matter to raise. As we all know, tomorrow we're moving on to the noise issue. We did ask initially the council then to confirm with the appellant a list of the operative noise and, in passing, air quality conditions and obligations. Whereabouts are we on that?
Pretty much there, sir. So there's a list that's agreed. There's one omission, which we're just double checking. I think the nod means that that's agreed. So there is now an agreed list, and we'll get that over to you probably later to this night to the programme officer. And what that will give you the document reference, the page number, and what the condition is that you need to look at. It'll also do the same for the planning obligations.
Okay, that's very helpful. Okay, look forward to that later on. I've got nothing further, Mr. Young.
Okay, all right then. So we'll adjourn now and we'll resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, sir.